Your brain burns 20% of your body's entire energy supply. It's only 2% of your weight. That math doesn't work. Muscle tissue that size wouldn't get away with that kind of energy bill. Neither would your liver, your kidneys, nothing else in your body operates at that kind of premium. And yet there it sits, inside your skull, quietly draining a fifth of every calorie you eat, every single day, without asking permission. That math didn't always work. For millions of years, it couldn't have worked because the fuel wasn't there. So something happened. Something that broke the rules of biology completely and let one species afford a brain no other animal on the planet could power. Today, we're talking about how your ancestors figured out cooking and why it might be the single most important invention in the entire history of our species. Let's go back before any of this was possible. Somewhere around 3 million years ago, your earliest ancestors were not predators. They weren't even particularly good foragers. They were scavengers, picking through the leftovers of animals that actual predators had already killed. And their diet reflected that. Tough, raw plant fiber, raw, scavenged meat when they could get it, insects, whatever they could physically chew and force down. Here's the problem with that diet. Raw food is expensive to digest. Your gut has to work overtime breaking down tough cellular walls in plants and dense raw protein in meat, and every hour spent digesting is an hour of energy that isn't going anywhere else. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, spend nearly half their entire day chewing. Not eating, chewing. Their jaws, their guts, everything about their bodies is built around the fact that raw food takes enormous physical effort just to extract calories from. Your ancestors were built roughly the same way, which means for those first couple million years, there was a hard ceiling on how much energy a human body could actually pull out of its food. And that ceiling meant a hard ceiling on brain size too, because brains are absurdly expensive tissue. Neurons don't work for free. Every thought, every signal, every process running in your skull right now costs calories, and a body operating near its energy limit simply cannot afford to keep expanding an organ that burns fuel at that rate. So for a long time, it didn't. Early hominid brains stayed roughly chimp-sized for an extraordinarily long stretch of evolutionary time. And then something shifted. The oldest solid evidence we have of humans controlling fire comes from Wonderwerk Cave in South Africa, dated to roughly 1 million years ago. Archaeologists found burnt plant ash and charred bone fragments deep inside the cave in a pattern that couldn't have come from a wildfire wandering in. This was fire being maintained, deliberately, inside a controlled space. And once you have controlled fire, you have the option to do something that no other species on this planet has ever figured out how to do on purpose. You can cook. Here's what cooking actually does, mechanically, to food. Heat breaks down tough plant cell walls before your teeth and stomach ever have to. Heat denatures proteins in meat, unwinding them into simpler chains your body can absorb far more easily. Cooking is, in the most literal biological sense, pre-digestion. You are offloading a huge chunk of the digestive workload from your own body onto a fire before the food even touches your mouth. And the calorie math on this is not subtle. Studies feeding lab animals identical meals, one raw and one cooked, have found that cooked food yields significantly more usable energy from the exact same ingredients. Same food, more fuel, just because of what heat does to it before you eat it. Now think about what that means for a species already living close to its energy ceiling. Suddenly, there's a caloric surplus. Suddenly, your body isn't spending nearly as much energy grinding through raw fiber and raw protein because the fire already did that work. And evolution, when it finds a surplus like that lying around, does not let it go to waste. Anthropologist Wrangham has argued for years that this exact shift, the move to cooked food, is what allowed the human gut to actually shrink. Smaller intestines, less tissue dedicated to digestion because digestion had gotten so much easier. And here's the part that should stop you. That freed up energy didn't just disappear. It went somewhere. It went to the brain. This is sometimes called the expensive tissue hypothesis. The idea that your body operates on a kind of energy budget, and if one organ gets cheaper to run, another organ can afford to get more expensive. Shrink the gut, expand the brain. And the timeline backs this up in an unsettling way. Homo erectus, the species that shows up right around the time we start seeing solid evidence of controlled fire use, had a noticeably larger brain than the hominids that came before it. Smaller jaw, smaller teeth, smaller gut cavity based on the shape of the rib cage in the fossil record. Every single one of those changes points the same direction. Less built for grinding down raw food, more built for running an expensive brain. This is not a small coincidence. Every major leap forward in human cognitive capacity lines up with periods where diet quality and cooking sophistication were increasing. It's not that cooking single-handedly built the human brain in one afternoon over a campfire. It's that cooking removed the caloric ceiling that had been capping brain growth for millions of years. And once that ceiling was gone, natural selection had room to work with. But cooking didn't just change your biology. It changed your entire day. Raw food, remember, takes hours of chewing just to get enough calories in. That's most of a chimpanzee's waking life, spent with a mouthful of leaves. Cooked food takes a fraction of that time to eat, which means your ancestors, almost overnight in evolutionary terms, had hours of their day suddenly freed up that used to be spent chewing. Hours that could go toward tool making, toward exploring further from camp, toward raising children who needed more attention because their own brains were now bigger and taking longer to develop, toward simply sitting together because there was time to sit together now. And this is where cooking stops being just a nutrition story and becomes a social one. A fire that cooks food is also a fire that people gather around. You don't scatter to individually chew raw scavenged scraps the way a solitary forager might. You bring food back to one central point because that's where the heat is, and everyone eats together at the same time in the same place. That's not a minor detail. That's the invention of the shared meal. The very first version of what would eventually become dinner, become the family table, become every meal you've ever eaten with another person sitting across from you. Researchers studying hunter-gatherer groups today have documented exactly this pattern. Practical talk happens throughout the day, scattered, task-focused. But food, cooked food specifically, has a way of pulling everyone into one spot at one time. And once you have a group of people sitting still together, fed, warm, with nothing urgent left to do, you have the conditions for something else to emerge. Conversation that isn't about logistics. Stories. The exact kind of nightly storytelling ritual anthropologists have documented again and again in surviving hunter-gatherer cultures, where the vast majority of nighttime talk around the fire shifts from practical to narrative almost the instant the sun goes down. So cooking didn't just feed a bigger brain, it built the social scaffolding that brain would eventually need to fill with language, culture, and shared memory. One invention, two enormous consequences, both still running inside you right now. Here's something else worth sitting with. Cooking also made food dramatically safer. Heat kills the bacteria and parasites that riddle raw meat, especially scavenged meat that had already been sitting exposed for hours before your ancestors got to it. Before cooking, every meal carried a real risk of illness, infection, sometimes death, just from what was living inside the food itself. Fire quietly solved a problem your ancestors probably never consciously understood they were solving. They weren't thinking about bacteria. They were just noticing, generation after generation, that cooked food made them feel better, more often than raw food did. And they kept doing it because it worked, long before anyone had any concept of why. Try, for a second, to imagine being the very first hominid to taste cooked meat. No memory of ever encountering that flavor before, no framework for what fire could do to food. Just the accidental discovery, probably from meat that fell too close to flames, that this thing tasted different, chewed easier, and somehow left you feeling fuller, longer, on less of it. That single accidental moment, repeated and refined over hundreds of thousands of years, is sitting underneath every meal you've ever cooked in your life. Every stovetop, every oven, every grill at a summer barbecue is a direct descendant of a fire in a cave in South Africa 1,000,000 years ago. And it's still shaping you today in ways you don't think about. Your gut is small compared to what a chimpanzee's gut would need to be to survive on your exact same diet. Your teeth are small. Your jaw is weak by great ape standards, because for the last 1,000,000 years, fire has been doing a huge portion of the digestive work your ancestors' bodies used to have to do alone. You are, quite literally, built around the assumption that your food will be cooked before it reaches you. Try to live purely on raw meat and raw starches for an extended stretch, and your body will struggle in ways a chimpanzee's body simply wouldn't, because your entire digestive system evolved on the assumption that fire would always be there to help. So the next time you're standing over a stove, or watching a burger sizzle on a grill, or just microwaving leftovers at 11 at night, you're not just making dinner. You're running a program that started in a cave 1,000,000 years ago when one of your ancestors sat close enough to a flame to notice something changed. That decision, repeated for 1,000,000 years, is the reason you have the brain sitting in your skull right now, burning through 20% of your energy without ever once asking if that math makes sense. It never did, on its own. Somebody, a very long time ago, made the math work. And you've been living off that decision ever since.